All right, in this video, we're going to be going over factoring and solving factored equations. So before we talk about how to factor, let's go ahead and look at a factored equation and how to solve those equations. So we'll just say solve the following. So when you come across an equation that has two parts to it, for example, if you had x times the quantity x plus 1 equals 0, and you wanted to solve for x, this is actually separated in this first part and then this second part. So each of these parts you can individually set equal to this here and then solve for x. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and set x equal to 0 and x plus 1 equal to 0. And then you can solve for x. So it's already solved for x here. So on this other side, we can just subtract 1 from both sides and get x is equal to -1. So the full answer for this particular equation is going to be x is equal to 0 and -1. All right. Now, if we had an example like the product of two binomials, for example, let's do x plus 2 times the binomial x minus 1, and that's equal to 0. Again, you're just going to set each individual part equal to 0. So we're going to have x plus 2 equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. So we're going to subtract 2 from both sides and get x equals -2. Add 1 to both sides, x equals 1. So the answer to this equation is x is equal to -2 and 1. All right. Now, if you were to get something that wasn't quite separated into two parts yet, for example, if we had x squared minus 4x equals 0, and you need to solve for x, one of the best things you can do is try to break it down into this form up here, where we've got something on the outside and then something that you're distributing to. So we're going to call that pulling out a factor. So you pretty much have to find a common factor between both of these terms, and then you can pull that out. Now, as you do this more and more, you'll just be able to look at that and know what factor you can pull out from there. But until then, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find your greatest common factor between the two terms, and then that's going to be what you pull out. So just a quick review on how to find the greatest common factor. We're going to go ahead and do a prime factorization of both of these terms. So here we're going to have x times x, and then here's 2 times 2x, 2 times x. And then we're just going to compare these. So for x squared, that's going to be x times x. And for 4x, that is equal to 2 times 2 times x. And then you circle anything they have in common and multiply all the common things together. So in this case, x is going to be our common factor. So we can actually pull an x out of here. And how you can do that is to multiply that whole equation by 1 by using the greatest common factor. but since we're multiplying by 1, we're just going to do the greatest common factor divided by the greatest common factor. All right, which is equal to 1. So in this case, our greatest common factor is x. We're going to do x over x times x squared minus 4x. All right, equals 0. Now, you've got to multiply each side by the same thing, so we're going to multiply that 0 by x over x as well. Now, in here, you're going to be tempted to take this and distribute it in here, but what you're going to want to do is take only this denominator, because remember, we're trying to pull this x out, so we want to leave that x on the outside. So let's go ahead and just take this denominator and distribute it to both the terms. So we're going to have x times x squared over x minus 4x over x equals 0 times x over x is just 0. So that goes away. Now you can simplify this part inside the parentheses. So we're going to have x times x squared over x is just x minus, these x's will cancel, so we'll just have 4 equals 0. So now we have it in a form where it's separated into two parts. So you can go ahead and set both parts equal to 0. So x equals 0, x minus 4 equals 0. Add 4 to both sides, x equals 4. So x equals 0 and 4. All right. Now, you may get something a little more complicated than just this, where this only has 2 parts to its equation. You might end up with something with 3 parts. For example, x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0. Now, when you look at that, you can't really directly solve for x because these have different powers. So you can't combine them and then just solve for x like we've done previously. And so what we want to do is kind of unfoil this. If you remember, foiling was a method we used to multiply binomials together. But when we unfoil, we call it factoring. So we're going to take this and turn it into the product of 2 binomials. In this case, it's going to end up being x plus 1 and x plus 7. But how do we get from this version to this version? So that way because we know how to solve this. This is just going to be x is equal to -1 and -7. Right? But how do we get to this point here? And we do that by factoring. And again, this factoring process is just a process of unfoiling. So because going from here to here, we foil, here to here, we factor. All right, so there's a couple of steps that you can use to try to help you along the way of factoring. And factoring is one of those things that you just kind of have to practice over and over and over again until you kind of pick up the skill of factoring. But let's go ahead and let's just look at this x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0. The first thing you want to do is draw your parentheses. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and draw these guys equal to 0. All right, the second thing you're going to want to do is look at the first term and determine factors. So, for this example, our first term is going to be this x squared. So it's going to be the one that has the highest power is going to be the one that you're going to want to consider as your first term. All right, so when we look at x squared, when we factor x squared, we know that x squared is equal to x times x. All right, so since we've only got two options here, we're just going to go ahead and place each of these in the beginning of each of the parentheses. So we're going to end up with putting x there and x there. All right. Next thing you want to do is focus in on the last and middle coefficient. All right, so in our case, we're going to be looking at this 8 here and this 7 here. All right, now your last term is always going to be the one without the variable. And your middle term is going to be your leftover one. So the one that doesn't have the highest power and the one that doesn't have any variables. So in this case, again, we're looking at this 8 and this 7. Let's go ahead and just rewrite that whole thing. X squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0. All right, now when you focus in on these, you need to come up with combinations of numbers that satisfy two conditions. So the combinations of two numbers need to multiply together to equal the last term coefficient. So in this case, that would be 7. Now those two numbers also need to add together to equal the middle term coefficient. In this example, that's going to be 8. All right. So numbers that multiply, there aren't very many numbers that multiply together to equal 7. So that's going to be pretty simple. The only ones that really work is going to be 1 and 7 here. So looking at this one, these numbers also need to add up to equal 8. And we're going to be doing that by taking a positive 1 and a positive 8 or positive 7. And combining those will give us a positive 8. So we can go ahead and put these terms into our parentheses right now. We've come up with that. But now we can add in our positive 1 and our positive 7. And then we can go ahead and solve for that by setting x plus 1 equals 0 and x plus 7 equals 0. Solve for x. X equals -1, -7. All right. And that is factoring and how to solve factored equations.